The assassination of John Kennedy was actually a turning point. Um, I mean, it's always easy to call these important things that happen um, turning points. And we have a turning point of the month, but it really was. And I think it was because, if nothing else, technology was catching up to us, leading the way. TV being probably the most important of the technologies that influenced how people thought and what people did. Certainly not the only one, but it was very important. It, you know, the World War II generation, the Great Depression generation, sometimes called the greatest generation. They had lived through the Great Depression, World War II, Cold War, Korean War. They had known unbelievable economic disaster, military disasters like Pearl Harbor, political disasters of all types, including the beginning of the Cold War. The World War II generation, greatest generation, never knew a world which had basic security, much less luxuries. The baby boomer generation, which I've sometimes called the hula hoop generation, experienced only mild versions of these problems. Even, as I had put on the slide here, even the cold Cuban Missile Crisis lasted only 13 days. So it was nothing at all like fighting a 4-year war in every continent except Antarctica, you know. It was just something that everything just kept on going. Um, and, you know, people you expect to get well because you had antibiotics. You expected to have a car that ran for 75,000 miles instead of 40. You expected air conditioning. You don't think about air conditioning, but it's one of the most important changes that occurs during this time, although certainly it had been invented much earlier. Um, and so basically, there is more material success in this period of time than there had ever been, ever, any time in human history. American society was just unbelievably well off. Even the lowest levels of society, outside of homeless, of course, even the lowest levels of society experienced an uptick in their living conditions. And so it just, you know, you could make mistakes and they weren't fatal. You could get things back. You know, you had the resources in which to cover up your mistakes, in a manner of speaking. And so, you know, one of the things that Lyndon Johnson said was, well, he wanted to create a great society. And certainly from a financial point of view, just sheer dollars, there was enough money around to create, quote unquote, a great society. Didn't work out that way, but nevertheless. And LBJ is associated with a good many very, very important things in American history. Vietnam, Great Society, the Civil Rights Revolution, the rise of the counterculture, which of course is kind of the culture we inherit nowadays, massive domestic unrest, and we'll talk about that down the road. What set off, no, what set off the Vietnam War, that's not really true. But what made the Vietnam War, this massive thing that occurred in the 1960s, was an exchange of gunfire off the Vietnamese coast between US ships and North Vietnamese ships. It was not very important. I think they found one bullet hole in one US ship. It was a minor incident. And a second incident that was apparently a misreading of radar. But it led to the passage of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And the Tonkin Gulf Resolution gave the president, in this case Lyndon Johnson, virtually a blank check to do whatever he wanted in Vietnam. Johnson had some problems, though. Johnson, very, very, very bright man, an incredible personality, one of the strongest personalities ever to be in the presidency. He didn't want to be the next Chamberlain. You might say, well, who's Chamberlain? Chamberlain is this guy right here. And what happened was, in 1938, he went to Munich to negotiate with Hitler, obviously. And the the result of that was that about a third of Czechoslovakia was handed over to Hitler. That was a third of Czechoslovakia that had Czechoslovakia's armaments and its security and all that stuff. So Hitler can just grab the rest of Czechoslovakia whenever he wants. Chamberlain, though, came home to England and said, we have peace in our time. Missed that one. Don't think he was right on that. But in any instance, Chamberlain becomes a symbol, and Munich becomes a symbol of what happens if you appease authoritarians, if you appease people who are aggressors. In fact, Chamberlain's trademark was an umbrella. And for a decade after that, after Chamberlain, if you wanted to call someone a coward, you handed them an umbrella. LBJ certainly did not want to become another Chamberlain. And so he felt that if he backed down in Vietnam, that just would not work well. We've already talked about the domino theory, that all these states would go communist or be conquered by the communists. And as I say, there's some reason to believe that that's probably true. I realize that there could be quite a debate on that one, but I think the evidence bends in the direction of the idea of the domino theory being correct. But under any circumstance, LBJ had no interest in becoming Chamberlain. The bad thing about that was Lyndon Johnson, tough as he was, did not believe we could win. We know that. I mean, the documents are very clear that Lyndon Johnson simply did not believe that we could win the Vietnamese War. The idea was to wear down Vietnam and avoid a war with Russia. And he attempted to force a negotiated settlement instead of a victory. Well, and he thought that by maybe leaning on the Soviets and kind of leaning on China, which we didn't recognize as a nation at that time, that we could do this. And China and the Soviets had very little control of Vietnam. China was weak, very weak as a matter of fact, and the Soviets had shown no stomach for big fights. So the impact that personal influence or wearing out North Vietnam, it was North Vietnam that you had to fight and not the other two. And of course, we're fighting, as the British had fought in the American Revolution, we were fighting on their home turf. Was the war winnable? Certainly the war was winnable. But did Johnson take the steps to win it? No. And frankly, the American military establishment bears a great deal of blame for this. I told you, of course, that TV was maybe the major, most important thing that happened from the point of view of changing who we are and what we do and how we think about things. The dang war came right into our living room. You'd be sitting there, you'd be munching on a hamburger, looking at your TV set in your easy chair, and this would come on the nightly news. And what happened in this particular instance is we napalmed, that's liquid gasoline, a village. You can see here, of course, a young lady here has torn off her clothes and she's trying to get away from the flames that are engulfing her body. Now, she will live, and she's still alive, as a matter of fact. These kinds of things are pretty upsetting and turn people against the war. The casualties mounted. You can see here that as the more troops we put in, the more dead we end up with. I don't think there's anything complicated about that. And that led, in the long run, to real domestic agony. Protests mounted everywhere. And while certainly the colleges had protests, other places had protests too. This was a failure on Lyndon Johnson's part. He did not share with the country, or maybe he couldn't share with the country. He couldn't talk to the country about what we were doing because he himself was not doing what needed to be done. He was too worried about setting off World War II and a half, as I say, with Russia or with China. And as a result, the reason for going to war remained dark, mysterious. They were perfectly sensible reasons. And had Johnson been a different president, had Johnson been a Reagan or Franklin Roosevelt, um, he could have explained the war to the American people, but he couldn't. It was his great weakness. And the weakness of all weaknesses, in a manner of speaking, was his inability to communicate with the American people as a people. And that, of course, establishes the culture. And that is, again, there's a major change in American life. So I want all of you to have a good day out there. I want you to stay healthy, and I will see you at the next lecture. Bye-bye.